Should we be ready to begin? It should be while we do the staff, Richie, if he's imminent. If he's not. All right. The Rules Committee will come to order. Today we are considering two measures. The first is H.R. 1994, the Secure Act. We have a retirement crisis in America today, and according to the National Institute on Retirement Security, the typical worker today has no retirement savings. More than 100 million Americans have no retirement assets at all. This is not just a problem for those nearing retirement. Millennials today have a crushing amount of student loan debt, with fewer employers offering things like health benefits. So they are often worse off than past generations. The Secure Act will make common sense fixes to our tax code and help more people save for their future. I'm glad to see the manager's amendment to this bill, submitted by the chairman, Chairman Neal, fixes a flaw in the Republican tax plan that resulted in Gold Star families, tribal families, and the families of first responders paying higher taxes. The second measure is H.R. 1500, the Consumer First Act. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created as part of Wall Street reform to combat unfair and deceptive financial practices, and it worked. By the end of 2016, this agency returned nearly $12 billion to more than 29 million ripped-off consumers. Many of those were service members and their families. It's no secret many of my friends on the other side never liked the CFPB, and once President Trump was in office, they finally had an ally in the White House to undermine it. Putting Mick Mulvaney, our former colleague, in charge of the CFPB was like letting the fox guard the hen house. This is someone who has called the agency, quote, a joke, and voted to dismantle it when he was in Congress. So it wasn't a surprise when he moved to dismantle it from within, weakening its enforcement, dismissing cases against payday lenders, dismantling protections for our service members. I go on and on and on and on. The Consumers First Act would reverse the harm that was done and put the cop back on the beat to protect consumers. So I now would like to turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments he would like to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I feel like I've been asking the majority every week whether they want to just score partisan points or they actually want to pass laws that will change people's lives for the better. Once again, the majority's answered that they prefer the latter, bringing up one hyper-partisan bill that won't pass the Senate and won't become law, and another bill that was bipartisan coming out of Ways and Means, and I fear will become less so by the time my friends on this committee are through with it. This is truly a disappointment. We had an opportunity this week, a real opportunity, to pass a bipartisan bill that will make the lives of millions of Americans better. Instead, the majority could reverse the bipartisan committee process and the agreement made between the chairman and the ranking member of the Committee of Jurisdiction. But I'll start with H.R. 1500, the misleadingly named Consumers First Act. I say the name is misleading because it really should have been called the Anti-Mick Mulvaney Act. That's really all the bill is, just a 40-page list of Democratic complaints about how Mr. Mulvaney ran the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Majority has also attempted to dress the bill up and add some prescriptive actions for the CFPB to take, but I don't think anyone will be surprised when I say that the CFPB already has the power to do the things the majority is telling them to do, as the current director told the Financial Services Committee during her appearance there in March. And so we're left with yet another partisan messaging bill that won't go anywhere in the Senate, won't become law, and is ultimately just another show vote for the majority. And then we have H.R. 1994, the Secure Act. which started life as a bipartisan compromise bill to help Americans enhance their retirement savings. Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Brady put together a bill that was so good, I even co-sponsored that bill. And then it went and passed out of Ways and Means by 40-0, unanimous support. And yet when the bill was brought to the Rules Committee, we're told that there would be a manager's amendment brought by Mr. Neal that would strip out an agreed-upon provision to help give children who are homeschooled every opportunity to succeed. This type of partisan gamesmanship is deeply disappointing. There's a lot to like in this bill. It will allow Americans to increase savings rates and ensure that many more workers have access to retirement accounts. This bill, as reported out of Ways and Means, is exactly the sort of bipartisan compromise legislation that can pass the Senate and can become law. We need to see more bills like this, and so it's confusing why the majority is undoing this great bipartisan work. I suspect, much like last week, the answer is that they are doing as instructed by outside interest groups. Mr. Chairman, we can and should do better. We should have more bills like the one Mr. Neal and Mr. Brady originally produced, not fewer. And we should take advantage of such opportunities as they come up, not take bipartisan bills and change them for partisan reasons at the Rules Committee. With that, I look forward to our hearing. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cole, and I'm delighted to welcome Chairman Neal and Mr. Smith. And anything you brought in writing without objection will be entered into the record. I now recognize my colleague from Massachusetts, the distinguished Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to members of the Rules Committee. So I want to acknowledge that your consideration of H.R. 1994, the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act today, is a really good piece of work. This bill passed the Ways and Means Committee unanimously and is the product of bipartisan collaboration with Ranking Member Mr. Brady. He had major influence on this legislation, even if there's one part of it that we found in disagreement at the end. It also includes provisions for Mr. Kelly and Mr. Kind. Mr. Buchanan, Dr. Rowe, and Tim Wahlberg are all included in this legislation. The SECURE Act includes common-sense proposals that will enhance our retirement system and represents the most comprehensive reform of our retirement system in 15 years. Too many American workers reach retirement age without the savings they need. The retirement crisis is real and will only worsen unless we make saving easier and do more to encourage workers to begin planning for retirement. One reason Americans reach retirement age with such little savings is that too few workers are offered an opportunity to save for retirement through their employers. According to AARP, workers are 20 times more likely to save if they have access to automatic enrollment deduction plans. And yet 55 million Americans are not able to save for retirement out of their paychecks. 10,000 baby boomers retire every single day in America as well. The SECURE Act will go a long way toward addressing the retirement crisis by helping American workers save for retirement. I met with Senator Grassley last week. The provision that was raised by Mr. Cole was not in their legislation, and he indicated to me that after this passes the Senate, that we will move on to a second round of increasing the opportunity for retirement savings. This bill makes it easier for small businesses to offer retirement plans to their employees by eliminating outdated barriers to the use of multiple employer plans. As a result of this provision, it is estimated that 700,000 new opportunities for retirement savings will be formed alone as part of this plan. Automatic enrollment is shown to increase employee participation and make it easier for workers to participate in 401k plans. The SECURE Act creates a new tax credit of up to $500 per year to small employers to defray startup costs for new 401k plans that include automatic enrollment. The SECURE Act also increases the age for required minimum distributions from retirement plans from 70.5 to 72. This is a substantial achievement. This age has not been adjusted since the 1960s, and with Americans working longer today, the proposals will give families additional time to save. This is a good, common-sense bill, and I want to thank publicly Kevin Brady for his hard work in helping to draft it with me. Both Republicans and Democrats have wins in this bill that we indeed can be proud of. It's also important to note that this bipartisan bill has the support of both consumer groups and industry, AARP, SEIU, the Church Alliance to Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts of America, the National Association of Women's Business Owners, and the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. Supporters also include TIAA, the Airline Pilots Association, the Women's Institute for Secure Retirement, AALU, ACLI, And I'm proud that we've had a very diverse group of organizations who recognize this common sense legislation that will be good for workers. Before concluding, I want to highlight an additional provision that is included in the manager's amendment as well. Part of the process here, incidentally. This is not unusual to have take place. This provision affects the financial security of children of our fallen troops, children of first responders who gave their lives in the line of duty, children who receive payments from tribal governments, college scholarship recipients, and potentially many more sympathetic cases that we're attempting still to discover. Due to changes that were included in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the amount of tax imposed on payments received by these children increased significantly. This bill eliminates that increase by repealing the entire provision outright. So before we do a technical corrections bill on the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, we are doing a technical correction right here in this piece of legislation that is widely popular and has already been highlighted in 60 Minutes. I've spoken before about the consequences of passing legislation in just 51 days without meaningful opportunities to examine the bill and its impact. This is an example of what happens with that process. So under the manager's amendment, the rules for the so-called kiddie tax will now return to their pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs parameters. Thank you for your consideration. I'm really proud of this legislation. And we worked hard to do this, to get this done. And it was well met by all members of the committee. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole. Last year, the House, on a bipartisan basis, twice passed legislation to help our workers and Main Street businesses save more and earlier for their future. And those reforms passed twice with Republican and Democrat support because we all understand the importance of this issue. With wages continuing to increase for blue-collar workers after years of stagnation, now is the perfect time to help families grow their nest eggs. Which is why I was greatly encouraged when I learned one of the first conversations Chairman Neal had with Ranking Member Brady, who I'm sitting in for today, was focused on getting a bipartisan retirement package sent to the President's desk. Together, Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, and many members on both sides of our committee developed the Secure Act. Our bipartisan legislation eases administrative burdens for businesses who offer retirement plans for their workers. It also makes some smart and needed changes to reflect today's workforce by modifying current age requirements surrounding IRAs. The age limit for making contributions to traditional IRAs is eliminated, and people are now required to pull from their accounts at the age of 72 instead of 70 and a half under current law. And equally as important, the Secure Act builds on the expansions made to 529 education savings accounts as part of the 2017 tax overhaul. In the Secure Act, we expand 529s even further so they can be used for costs associated with apprenticeships, homeschooling, and student loans. Our bill, which cleared our committee with all 25 Democrats voting yes and all 17 Republicans supporting it as well, deserves to go to the floor as it is currently written. Chairman Neal's leadership helped us usher a bill to this committee today, which is good for parents, good for kids, and good for our economy. And the process through which this bill was drafted is a prime example of how Congress is supposed to function, from the committee up, working closely with members on both sides of the aisle until we get a product all members can agree on. As this bill is being considered by your committee today, Chairman McGovern, I ask that you and Ranking Member Cole consider thoroughly the potential ramifications of modifying the legislation just to appease partisan special interest groups. It is pro-education to allow parents to use their savings to buy books, hire tutors, and get children with special needs the education tools they need to succeed. And it is also pro-family to give parents an extra hand as they work to help their child reach their highest potential. Ranking Member Brady, as a former chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, wanted me to share with you that he understands the pressures which come from leadership to sometimes change bills at the last minute. It's certainly a difficult tightrope to walk, and I deeply respect the work that Chairman Neal and you, Chairman McGovern, have done to operate your committees on your terms. You both have worked in the interest of your members, allowing every voice to be sincerely heard before moving legislation forward, and I believe this is how Congress is meant to function. Our fear is that if a top-down approach is what is going to decide how every bill is written going forward, not much of substance will be accomplished these next 2 years. But that is not the way to do business. Members working together in good faith to develop strong bipartisan legislation should be rewarded, not undermined. Especially with the Secure Act, the bill we have today will greatly benefit moms and dads, teachers and students, and workers and local businesses. This bill before us, as written, passed our committee with bipartisan support. The way it is written deserves bipartisan support from this committee and from the entire House as well. I ask, Mr. Chairman, that you don't strike the provisions surrounding 529 plans, and I certainly urge Chairman Neal to change the manager's amendment, which I understand he is intending to offer. Striking the provisions would be unfair to parents trying to help their child with disabilities get the educational assistance they deserve. It would be unfair to families wanting to buy books and school supplies, and it would be unfair to those who choose to homeschool their children. Let's honor the work Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, and committee members achieved on a bipartisan basis and pass the Secure Act as is so we can make a deal with the Senate soon. Thank you. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you both being here. And just, Chairman Neal, just, again, if you could just explain one more time how the manager's amendment helps bring relief to Gold Star families, tribal children, and others, because I think that's, I think a lot of people were surprised that they were penalized in the last tax bill, and I think it's important for people to know that one of the things your manager's amendment does is fix this.
So I don't allude to anything that's malevolent in what happened with that issue, but I think it was an oversight, and I think the problem that largely occurred because of the fact that the tax bill was written in 51 days without any hearings or without any witnesses. There are 78 proposed technical corrections to the tax bill. After this, and after Friday or Thursday, we'll be down to 77. And I intend to bring up a technical corrections bill at some point going forward, and I think everybody will have an opportunity to weigh in on it. This was an egregious error in the drafting that took place. And the result was, as I watched, as I noted a while ago, 60 Minutes about a month ago, one Sunday evening, what happened here for some of these families at the top marginal rates and how their income was treated, where the children all of a sudden are paying based upon estate tax margins.
Right.
And I think that this is a big provision. I'm confident, by the way, when this gets to the floor, that this is going to get a lot of Republican votes. And I noted earlier that I included Republicans in this bill because I wanted this bill to come to the floor and pass the way that it's likely to today, as shaped. But I also think that they would say, we tried very hard to include them in these measures, but this was a very important fix to the tax bill, and I think it'll be very well met by all members of the House.
I would add that the language that is actually being corrected regarding the Gold Star families, that language was around for, well, since the so-called camp draft that was offered. And I think it was unintended, certainly, but the language was around for some time.
But you support fixing it, right?
I support fixing it,
Okay, all
yes.
right. I appreciate it. Mr. Hastings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate both our witnesses. I have no questions.
Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. I want to first congratulate you because I actually agree the bill is a very good bill. There's a lot of good provisions in it, and you worked very hard as a committee. And the 529 issue, and I'm just in full disclosure, pretty personal to me, because my late chief of staff homeschooled his 3 children. His wife, who now works for another member, took herself out of the workforce while all 3 of those children got to high school, and then they, at that point, moved into a public school system. And I know lots of families like that actually homeschool at considerable sacrifice. Now, so can you tell me why, when this had passed unanimously, and the committee report actually says the committee believes that expanding 529 plans will help families save for educational expenses that meet each family's unique needs. Why is that being taken out now?
Well, we kept, Mr. Cole, we kept 2.
Tom's fine.
Fine. We kept 2 of the 4 529 provisions. There were objections in our caucus to how the measure was proceeding. And in order to make sure that this legislation passed, I was willing to make an accommodation based upon that.
Well, you're expecting a lot of Republican support because there's so many good things in this bill. Why would we take out one thing? There would be plenty of Democratic support, whether this was in or not. So why was the decision
There were
made
members
to
of our
take it out?
caucus that objected,
A substantial number?
a substantial number.
Really?
We know around here what happens when measures move from committee to the floor and what happens at the last minute when people have a provision that is, in their minds, not clearly explained. So I took this to members of our caucus, and they sought the change, and I honored the change.
Well, why don't we get an amendment on it then and have a vote on it? Why does this have to be done in the management? Let's have a separate
Because
vote on
tax
this
bills
issue.
that come to the floor are generally done under the provisions that we've asked Mr. McGovern to honor here.
I don't think, this is a technical corrections bill. This isn't really a big, normal tax bill. So I don't think if there's a scoring issue, as a matter of fact, we would probably have that in a number of these provisions on relatively minor, because again, these are technical corrections. But why would you be in favor? Are you personally opposed to this provision? Because you voted for it in committee.
I am in favor of getting the measure to the floor and passed.
Well, it's going to get passed anyway. I mean, that's the point.
appreciate
I
your
mean,
confidence,
I'm
yeah.
sorry, but that's the point. It's going to be passed. There are so many good things in here, as you pointed out, and I agree. If I had my name on it, I thought it was a very good piece of work. But this is just, picking out literally millions of families and saying, we're going to exclude you from the process, even though 40-0 in committee. Did anybody raise any question in the committee about this provision?
This affects less than 200,000 people.
Only 200,000.
Less than 200,000.
Less than 200,000. Did anybody in the committee raise this issue, in the committee?
If you trace the history of this, I objected early on. In seeking accommodation with the ranking member, I decided to proceed.
Was there
We got
any
to the
objection in
floor.
the committee?
It was not a committee, it was not an objection in the committee.
Anybody offer an amendment to strike this
There was
provision?
no provision offered to strike the bill, but I attempted to accommodate the interest of the former chairman, only to discover by the time we're prepared to bring this to the floor that were members of our caucus that objected. And we kept 2 of the 4 529 provisions, incidentally.
Is there any objection on our side, Mr. Smith?
No, I mean, I think it's a popular provision. I would imagine, I don't have the exact numbers, but the 200,000 number, I would imagine is probably 200,000 households. In terms of individuals, it would be significantly more than that. I think it's fair to say that the discussion that took place during the TCJA is that, say, the tax deduction for classroom teachers that equated to about $37 benefit, I think, on average. That got a lot of discussion, didn't end up in the House version, but the final version, it did have that. Let it be known that this 529 request is a more modest request than based on the nature of 529s as compared to the full deduction that was offered in the final version of TCJA.
Well, I just, again, I very much regret this decision. Would encourage the chairman to, if we're going to do something like this, let's have an amendment. That way, everybody can voice their objections on the floor if they care to, and they could make a decision on the final bill. But putting in a manager's amendment, to me, is an inappropriate way, after the fact, change the work of the committee, and work that came out unanimously, and work that the report specifically praised this particular provision. I mean, to me, that's pretty unprecedented. Did any outside groups come and ask about
I
this?
say this, Mr. Cole, having been around here for 31 years, I wouldn't call this unprecedented.
Well, I would. I'm not on the Ways and Means Committee. We think a lot of the things you guys do are unprecedented. But seriously, did any outside group come and ask about this?
No outside group spoke to me
No outside
directly.
group made any request that this provision
Members of
be
my
struck.
caucus spoke to me.
Are you aware of any outside groups that were opposed to this?
That one particular provision, it is my understanding that it was not directly to me, but, I mean, it's only hearsay at this point.
Well, I think we'll probably find out more about that going forward. I don't want to end on a sour note. I want to thank you for the work you did here. That's very good work. I wish we would see more of it. I'm a little disappointed that we tampered with it after it came out of committee. And hopefully, Mr. Chairman, we'll have an amendment to deal with this, and then we'll see where the votes really are. We'll see how many members have strong enough concerns that they would, 1, vote against the amendment, and 2, vote against the bill. I don't think you'll find very many of the latter that would do that, because the work is such good work, and the problem is such an important problem. And I want to commend both of you for working. I think, broadly speaking, this really puts the interests of the American people first. It helps us with a pressing issue. But I hate to leave out tens of thousands of Americans that had every reason to believe they were going to be included and then were excluded at the last moment. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Torres.
I just want to say thank you both for working together on this, and I yield back.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on Ms. Torres's working together. I was looking forward, I told my staff last week, so I'm looking forward to coming to this meeting, because I keep thinking the page of partisan chicanery, for lack of a better word, is that we're getting ready to turn that page, and we're about to get serious. I want to ask you, Mr. Neal, because I know you and the ranking member work so well together, and not that Mr. Smith's not an able representative of the Ways and Means Committee, but I wish the ranking member were there. I was reading the same report that Mr. Cole read from about all the wonderful things that your committee report that you drafted and your team drafted said this provision would do, and I'm looking at your manager's amendment and the good things that are in there. It's, golly, what do we have here? 5 pages of amendments, 5 pages of text. I think it's just this one line that divides us. And I guess I have a couple of questions. I want to share my concern first. It is not unprecedented to have a good piece of bipartisan legislation tainted by the Rules Committee before it goes to the House floor. It's not unprecedented to have the chairman of the committee, who presides over unanimous legislation, come and have to carry the language that taints legislation before it goes to the House floor. And it's probably not unprecedented, though I have never seen it in the 25 years that I've been watching this process, that one brings language to help Gold Star families and then incorporates it with the controversial language that divides folks and packages it all together, right? Do we sometimes see national security used in partisan ways? We do. Have I ever seen Gold Star families used to cover up something that is otherwise a divisive issue? I haven't. And I wanted to put that to you. You've been in this institution longer than I. Is that commonplace to partner Gold Star families to cover up divisive partisan legislation?
I hope that you don't assume that there was any nefarious motive on something like this. This had to be done. And clearly, I think your description, as you showed me the legislation, highlights the differences that now exist on Capitol Hill that once didn't, and that is, we disagree over one sentence in the bill, Mr. Woodall. That's it, one sentence.
You may make my point that while folks may watch the process and perceive it as nefarious, it doesn't need to be.
There was no intention to be nefarious with that provision. It had to be done, the sooner the better.
And so my ask of the chairman would be, and I serve in the minority on the Rules Committee, all right? We've 9 folks vote one way, 4 folks vote the other. I can predict with some regularity how the vote comes out here. Same thing's true with a big majority like Democrats have on the House floor today. I can predict with some regularity when Speaker Pelosi starts to lead the legislative train, where that train's going, where that destination's going to be, it's passage. Because it is a serious concern, because it does color an otherwise also shared value of helping Gold Star families, I guess my ask of you would be, I'm willing to, we talk a lot about waiving rules, and certainly Ways and Means has different jurisdiction, and the Rules Committee does have a separate special role to play, as you pointed out. I would be happy to vote with the majority to give all the necessary waivers to have this, what we can all agree is a homeschooling provision. It's designed to help, like I'll read from your committee report, who it's designed to help. Tax-free distributions for homeschooling expenses, including curriculum materials, books and instructional materials, online educational materials, tutoring and educational classes outside of the home, dual enrollment in institutes of higher education, and educational therapies for students with disabilities. This is what the committee voted unanimously to do, is to help families with these expenses. Would you be amenable, again, got the votes to win, to take that provision out of the manager's amendment? Let us self-execute And for folks who don't know, self-execute means give the House no other vote on it at all, make it all a process, a procedural vote here in the Rules Committee, but no policy vote on the floor. Let us self-execute the bipartisan solution to the Gold Star families that you and Mr. Smith both agree on, and then let us offer as a separate amendment on the floor of the House this issue that your caucus has trouble with, and let folks vote against it if they'd like, but to put Republicans who do support homeschoolers, who do see the expenses that these families have, that do watch families with special needs children having to do extraordinary things back home, to put them in the position that they've either got to vote against those families with disabilities or against Gold Star families. I don't understand how that advances us as either an institution or you all as a committee.
But you should know that we did not begin on the principle of a quid pro quo or a trade-off on this. That's all. That's really the crux of the matter. And I would say this to you in fairness, that I am happy on a matter of principle here, not in this manager's proposed amendment here, but down the road to discuss this issue as a matter of goodwill, for sure. And you do get a motion to recommit.
Right. Thank you.
We absolutely do. The Energy and Commerce Committee is very proud of saying they have more jurisdiction than any other committee in the House. Candidly, with all due
Mr.
respect.
Smith and I would disagree.
I will, and with respect to our E&C member sitting to my right, figuratively and literally, I am incredibly concerned about the number of big picture things that you all have to do over these next 18 months. And I know you could, and you would agree with me, you could have no better partner than Kevin Brady in doing that. He would have said exactly the same thing about you had he been here. It's tough to put some of the arrows back in the quiver once we pull them out. If this is going to be the single biggest issue that we have that divides us over the next 18 months in terms of getting something done in a bipartisan way for the country, what a blessing that would be.
You should know I will not let the one issue get in the way of the many big things that we have yet to do and intend to do in the next 18 months.
And I take the gentleman at his word. I know it to be true. I suppose the comforting words I would actually ask for is, do you believe that of the bipartisan atmosphere that you've created on the committee, that by having the Rules Committee self-execute language that erases the bipartisan agreement that you all came to, do you believe we're not going to disadvantage the committee and its partnership going forward?
My intention is to proceed at the Ways and Means Committee with bipartisan achievements, and I think that we've got at least 3 or 4 more coming up that are substantive in nature, and we intend to get them done.
We've got a little time before our vote, Mr. Chairman. I would ask that you ask your team to take a look at this again. All the necessary waivers that you need, I would be happy to support as a member of the minority when that time comes. Let us join together as an institution to support Gold Star families. Let us join together as an institution to support these much-needed changes in retirement programs, and let us vote our conscience on families with children with needs that are being met at home today. I thank the gentleman for his fair candor. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And let me just repeat for the record what Mr. Neal just said. I mean, the reason why we have to help the Gold Star families is because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted in a way that disadvantaged them. I mean, that's just the fact. And so now we have to fix it. And so we wouldn't be even having this discussion if the tax bill went through regular order, if we had, if we had hearings and we were able to discern this early on, but that didn't happen, and it was rushed through, and it went to the floor, and so we have this problem. We're going to fix it.
Would the chairman yield?
I'm happy to yield.
I appreciate that. As my friend Mr. Smith said, this language has been around for 2 years. The bill was rushed through. The language was not rushed through, but I stipulate that everything the gentleman said was true. None of it spoke to my concerns about families with children who are receiving their education at home. And the fact that that's the go-to for the chairman to go back to that partisan well that we know divides us as the tax bill, it'd be just like me going back to the Affordable Care Act.
Yep.
And I would say that's why I'm concerned this is going to poison the well.
And hopefully we can vote in a bipartisan way to help the Gold Star families that were disadvantaged when the tax bill was rushed through here. And I think that is an important thing we should come together on. as Chairman Neal pointed out, I mean, the gentleman talks as if this bill is only about this one provision. This bill is pretty wide in scope and includes a lot of things that are going to help a lot of people. And I think the gentleman is right that when it comes to the floor, it will get a big bipartisan vote. I would also remind the gentleman that he has a motion to recommit. And much to my dismay, sometimes you guys win on the motion to recommit. So you can have this debate, and you will have your opportunity to have your amendment, if this is what you choose to pursue, but there will be an opportunity. So I point that out.
I thank the gentleman for
Thank
yielding.
you. I yield to Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and gentlemen, thank you for this bill. I'm going to support this bill. I think it's great. My friends have been complaining about the loss of the homeschooling provision. You know, there are some amendments here that I would love to see, like repealing the government pension offset, which affects millions of Americans. Wasn't part of the big tax bill, could have helped teachers and all sorts of individuals all across the country. Mr. Graves has proposed that as an amendment. I'd love to see that part of this piece of legislation, but I'm not going to push this. I'd ask you to, as you go through your, various technical corrections and try to fix the tax cut bill, which, in my opinion, just really helped the wealthiest Americans and not the rest of us. This, the repeal of the offset, helps a lot of us, just ordinary Americans. So I think you've done a great job. I support this every way to Sunday. But if you get a chance to talk about that offset and really compare it to what we did in terms of the giant tax cut years ago, it's one that does help everyday Americans, and I'd love to see you pursue that. And if you want to say something, do it, but
Please.
the chairman's going to get mad at me for
So,
supporting
no,
it.
so Mr. Perlmutter, every time that, if you happen to be watching the proceedings of the Ways and Means Committee, and you see Mr. Brady and I whispering to each other, you can be sure that one of those topics includes the WEP.
So I thank you, gentlemen, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate both the chairman and both chairmen's advice on the motion to recommit. I'll take that up with my leadership. You never know. Maybe you'll get a chance to see it again. As far as the windfall elimination provision, the government pension offset, I would agree with Perlmutter. We need to fix that. It's been years, and I would be in favor of fixing that as well. Well, let me just ask you, Mr. Smith, I mean, you went through the hearings on this bill, went through the markup, what Chairman Neal has referred to as the consternation that came from his side. Did you feel any, on the 529 provision, did you feel any of that welling up during the legislative hearing and the markup?
No.
When were you first aware of this?
2 weeks ago, maybe?
And how did it surface? What form did it take?
There was just discussion among members, and the ranking member made us aware. I think it was communicated to him, and he communicated to us.
But at this point, you had already done the markup on the
Oh, yes.
on the bill that's before us? And was there any attempt within the committee structure itself to resolve this issue before bringing it to the floor?
I couldn't speak to that.
So you
Not that I'm aware of.
You didn't have any discussions? You were yourself, as a member of the committee, a minority member of the committee?
Side conversations with members, colleagues, is what took place.
Yes, Mr. Neal?
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Mr. Brady and I spoke of this a number of times.
I guess I'm just having trouble understanding why, at a date after, I mean, this was not new information. The 529 provision was added to the tax bill in December of 2017. If I recall correctly, that was an amendment by one of my senators when this bill was heard over on the Senate side and adding the 529 provision. It was a little bit dicey at that time, and I think the amendment, the Cruz amendment, passed on a party line vote and may have required the participation of the vice president that night when Mr. Manchin decided not to vote for what he had originally committed to vote for. But then that's the last I've heard of it, and to have it come up now with such vehemence that, I mean, Mr. Woodall has, I think, put it in the clearest of terms. We have homeschool children, we have children with special needs, and we're now saying we're excluding them from consideration on this. I must admit, I frankly don't understand. So if someone is willing to share with me why the concern is there, why the consternation, I'd be happy to listen to that discussion. But right now, it's just a big mystery. It's almost as if we want to take an anti-homeschool vote, we want to take an anti-special needs child's vote. Why would we want to do that?
You shouldn't construe that way, that this is anti-anybody. That is not our intention. And the idea that we would have targeted or picked somebody or some group out as we move forward on a very important piece of retirement legislation, that would not have been our intent, not even a consideration.
Mr. Smith, can you help me at all understand this?
I mean, I certainly can't speak for the opponents to this homeschooling provision, but I would hope that public policy should, treat all children the same. The needs are obviously there, whether it's, and the school supplies in different forms. Different kids need for different reasons, and I would hope that public policy would reflect that.
Well, I just have to say, when Senator Cruz offered this amendment in December of 2017, it was extremely popular back home. I have a large homeschool population in my district. The district that I represent also has a fair number of special needs children. One time we had a state school, and as a consequence, attracted a number of families in the area because of the services that campus could offer. And my hometown of Denton, Texas, just kind of has a reputation for that, and people come because of the expertise that the county has. I don't understand why we would try to disadvantage those populations. Again, there was a lot of enthusiasm for what Senator Cruz was able to accomplish when he passed his amendment. And it was a big deal that night. It was a late night vote. The entire vice presidential motorcade had to come out from the Naval Observatory. I mean, it was a big deal, but he got his amendment passed, and people back home were, I think, appropriately appreciative of Senator Cruz's effort to get that amendment passed. So it's very disconcerting to me now to see at the 11th hour on this bill, after it went through the committee process, that we've now decided that no, those populations aren't worthy of our consideration. Not that there aren't other populations we should consider. That's been brought up and well expressed in this hearing, but I don't understand why we would disadvantage those other populations. Can I just ask one other unrelated question? Why can't you put real estate in a retirement account? Did you look at that at all as far as this modernization of retirement accounts?
I do think that real estate is treated pretty well in the tax code. An examination going forward could include something like that, be an opportunity to talk about it. I mean, I don't think, again, that we started with, let's narrow the opportunity. It was more of...
We're talking about narrow provisions, and we'll stick to that.
All right, very well. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Scanlon.
Chairman Neal and Representative Smith, thank you for your work on putting together this comprehensive bipartisan bill. A lot of great work, and a lot of it's going to be really important to constituents in my district. I think 2.1 million people in Pennsylvania, about a third of our workforce, work for employers that don't have retirement plans, so that's going to be really helpful to them. I've heard a lot already from constituents about the Gold Star benefits, so I'm really thankful that you're working on that, and happy to hear that there's so much concern about making sure we have adequate funding for students with special needs, and I hope that my colleagues from across the aisle will join us in working for full funding of the IDEA this year. So thank you.
Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank both of you, Representative Neal and he's not here, but Representative Brady and Representative Smith. You know, this is, since I've been here about a little over a year now, it's been so partisan here. I used to be in the state Senate where we actually got things done, and so it's a little frustrating. So I'm actually very happy that we've got something done in a bipartisan fashion that actually really helps Americans. I have 70,000 senior citizens in my district, and the part of this that delays, the time that you have to take disbursements and that you can actually contribute past a certain age, I think will be helpful. Obviously, it's very important to incentivize small businesses and businesses to offer retirement plans because we have so many people that aren't saving enough money that I am really concerned about the future, that there's going to be people that don't have enough money to retire, and then we're going to have to come up with money to figure it out a way. So I just want to say thank you. I think it's good. I am disappointed, like my fellow Republicans are, about taking out the homeschooling factor in the 529 education plans. In Arizona, we're very pro-school choice. We've started it in 1994 with charter schools and, different things. And so I'm not as mystified as Mr. Burgess about why some of your colleagues are opposed to homeschooling in Arizona. They're always railing. My Democrat colleagues there always railed against homeschooling, and the only thing I could conclude it was competition because the district schools wouldn't get paid for those students to be there. And so I'm disappointed. I'm not surprised, but I'm glad that at least we're working on big issues together. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you.
Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to compliment the committee on what I think is an outstanding bill. There is really a retirement crisis, and one of the things I want to point out is the number of people on Social Security that live only on Social Security. That 43% of singles and I think around 21% of married couples get 90% of their income from Social Security. Anything we can do to add to that retirement is important to all of us. And of the 62 million people, a lot of the people that live only on Social Security are minorities and women. We should remember that as we're making efforts to improve other streams of income for our citizens. So thank you very much.
Hey, can I make a quick, Ms. Shalala as well, a reminder, the average Social Security benefit is $16,000. That means 50% of the recipients live on less than $16,000.
Mr. Desagne, all set? No other questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Neal, Mr. Smith. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
And I think, Mr. Mitchell, you are the only other person here to testify on the Secures Act. Am I right? Everyone else is here for the other bill? So you have the whole table to yourself. All set. Welcome. You're it. Welcome.
Thank you for allowing me.
Is your mic on? Make sure your mic's on. Okay.
Try again. Thank you, sir. Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, thank you for allowing me some time to speak on my amendment. It really gets to the issue we're talking about here in terms of the 529 language. We all understand the importance of financial security for retirees. That's why I was really pleased to see this bipartisan effort on this bill. The Secure Act has a lot of things to improve retirement benefits and retirement system for Americans. It provides access to multiple employer and pooled employer retirement plans to a variety of tax credits. By increasing the age, the distributions must be taken out, allows people to continue to save. Some of us will save money well into our 70s. increases eligible savings and allowing for new child and adoption savings for parents that adopt. That's a personal thing for me. My spouse and I adopted our now 9-year-old 7 years ago from Russia. I can tell you the cost of adoption, either domestically or overseas, is significant, and for many families is an incredible burden. So allowing them that option to do something that frankly is a positive thing, is good for society and good for families, is a wonderful thing. As the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Education, Innovation, and Opportunity, it used to be called school choice, but that's not all it is. I was happy to see the bill expand 529 allowable use of funds. Supplemental curriculum materials would be allowed. Online tuition services, dual enrollment opportunities, educational therapies for students with disabilities. Not just homeschooling. While I appreciate that's a good handle for it, it's easy to describe that way, it's far from the only purpose of that language. I support providing families the opportunity to save money for their individual child's educational needs, especially those with learning disabilities. And that's a personal issue for me. It's a personal issue. I asked Chairman Neal if I wanted to stay because I think it's more than 200,000 people. I say it's personal because my 9-year-old has significant learning disabilities. We take him to tutoring for reading and math 3 days a week. My wife homeschools him because of that. Think about that. We have resources to do that, but how many families do not? And yet they want to educate their child. He goes to tutoring 3 days a week, 2.5 hours a day, just for that. You can imagine what that is. He's 9 years old, and he can't read yet. He's not alone, and you all know that. You all know the burdens that puts on families, both financially and emotionally. I want to say that again. He's 9, and he can't read yet. He has apraxia. He has speech disabilities. I can go through the list. And we know, among the people that you serve, you have other constituents with the same problem. This gives them an option. Why are we taking that away? I don't understand that. The committee of jurisdiction approved the language without so much as a concern at the time. I've stated on numerous occasions, school choice is not about public versus private education. It's about choice for a parent to do what's best for their children with whatever resources they can gather together to help their child. And that's what it ought to be, because it is their child ultimately, frankly. And they know best the needs they face. I'm dismayed, not disappointed. We've used disappointed. I'm sorry, I'm dismayed that because some groups would be concerned, would complain about this one line, this one section of the bill, that it would be so quickly taken out rather than have debate on the floor. If there are members that are concerned about it being some form of threat to public education, then let's have that discussion on the floor. Let's have a vote on the floor, Mr. Chairman. And with all due respect, MTRs are viewed as adversarial. This should not be adversarial. This is about children. It's about educational resources for those children. It's about supporting families trying to find any way they can to support their children, if it means taking the risk of taking money out of retirement to do so. So why would we penalize them in doing that? I'm simply asking the committee for a simple vote on the floor to allow this language to remain, to change the manager's amendment, to remove what the chairman has done, to delete that out of the bill. If in fact, the majority of the members that you expressed, Chairman Neal expressed some concern about, feel they do not believe it's an appropriate use of retirement income, I want them to stand up, go to the box, and take a vote and be counted. Because I guarantee I can come up with a lot of parents of children with disabilities who say they'll do anything they can to help their children get the education they need, and we're responsible for doing that. I don't care if it's 200,000, if it's 100,000, if it's 2 million. I don't know how many there are, but I can find out if you like. How hard is it to allow a vote for children? And that is what it is, with all due respect. Let's stop the politics. Let's do the right thing here. And I ask you with absolute passion, in case you hadn't noticed, it is wrong to take that language out. I yield back and have to answer questions, sir.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And again, you do have an MTR, and next time we have an MTR that we're losing, I will invoke your words that it should be viewed as adversarial, because we have lost some MTRs, not only in recent this recent Congress, but when we were last in the majority, my Republican friends were a lot more disciplined than we were. But there will be a debate, and if you choose, you can use your MTR to talk about this issue. And I appreciate you being here. Mr. Hastings.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I appreciate very much your presentation, and I have no questions.
Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've made my points on this, but I certainly support my friend's amendment, and I appreciate you coming and offering it.
Mr. Cole, can I make one clarification, if I could, sir? I said that the MTRs are often viewed, particularly by the majority on the floor, as adversarial. And I didn't say that they are adversarial. In many cases, they're intended to improve a bill. I believe this warrants more concern than simply disposing of it as MTR and making it a partisan issue. But I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate my friend's point, and again, I don't see this as an adversarial issue, and I think it had been left in the bill, it would sail through without any doubt at all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Anybody on our side have a question? Anybody? Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Mr. Mitchell putting a personal voice to a very personal issue for so many families. I often watch the eyes of my colleagues when folks come up to testify, because sometimes these hearings can run a little bit long, and sometimes folks are coming to make a point instead of making a difference. Every member on this committee knows you came up here to make a difference tonight, and every member on this committee knows that you're right. You said it's not a hard thing to do, and as long as folks don't vote in party lockstep on these issues, they're not hard things to do. That's the way the Ways and Means Committee got this bill out to begin with, was including it in a completely bipartisan, unanimous decision, and we should be voting unanimously to make your amendment in order tonight. I very much appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Mitchell for bringing the amendment to our attention, and it is an important amendment, and I believe we should make it in order.
Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I, too, want to thank Representative Mitchell. It's a great amendment. I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will consider it. There are, my staff just told me, there's an estimated 2 million children that are homeschooled in the United States, and I have seen some of them, like your son is homeschooled, and it's for a variety of reasons, and that's the reason that I support all schools. I support district schools, charter schools, private schools, and homeschooling, because not all children are the same. And they can't all, fit in one box at one place. And so I remember my daughter had a classmate that kept getting bullied all the time. I think it maybe about like 5th or 6th grade, something like that, to the point where his mother, nothing was done by the district school, and his mother had to take him out of school, and she decided to homeschool him. Well, that was what was best for him. And so I do not understand this rationale by some of my colleagues why they're so against school choice. The only thing I can think of is that it's about the money, that the district schools want the money for that child, because they get paid per student. That's the only thing I can think of. Why would you be against parents' choice for their kids? So thank you for this amendment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mitchell?
Mr. Mitchell, I just wanted to thank you for coming up here and giving us your testimony. It's very compelling. You may not get what you want today, but the fact that you've been willing to testify personally about this is important to all of us, and I appreciate that. And I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
I echo that. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Anybody, I think that concludes the testimony for the Secures Act. We will now go to H.R. 1500, the Consumers First Act, and I'd like to call up our next panel, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry. We're delighted that you are here, and anything you brought, please submit. Anything you brought in writing, please submit, and you feel free to summarize. And I would also like to, take note of the fact that the former staff director of the Rules Committee, Steve Cody, is here. That actually helps you, right? So it's great to see him back, and I now will yield to Chairwoman Waters.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee for having me here to testify on H.R. 1500, the Consumers First Act, which returns the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to its original mission of protecting consumers from unfair, deceptive, or abusive acts or practices by banks and other financial institutions. Nearly a decade ago, unregulated and unchecked predatory lending sent us into the Great Recession, which cost millions of Americans their jobs, their homes, and their savings. In response, Congress created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The Consumer Bureau is the only federal agency with the sole purpose to protect every consumer of financial products and services and to hold bad actors fully accountable when consumers are harmed. Under the leadership of former Director Richard Cordray, the Consumer Bureau was a tremendous success, returning nearly $12 billion to over 30 million consumers who were harmed. With new procedures, protections, consumers no longer had to worry about exploding mortgages, hidden prepaid card fees, or unnecessary foreclosures due to weak service and standards. The Consumer Bureau also helped to take the confusing jargon out of consumer lending by requiring easy-to-understand disclosures from financial institutions, empowering consumers to make the best financial decisions for themselves and their families. However, when President Trump sent Mick Mulvaney, his OBM director at the time, to run the Consumer Bureau in November 2017, Mulvaney began to take the agency apart from the inside and prioritize the financial services industry at the expense of consumers. He stripped the Office of Fair Lending and Equal Opportunity of its ability to enforce fair lending laws, turned a blind eye to uncovering abuse of active duty service members and their families, closed the Office of Students and Young Consumers, closed it up to payday lenders, and fired the Consumer Bureau's Consumer Advisory Board, the entire board. On Mulvaney's watch, staffing was reduced by more than 10%, leaving fewer cops on the block to protect consumers. In fact, the agency issued 75% fewer public enforcement actions in 2018 compared to the annual average for the previous 3 years. And worse, there have been zero public fair lending enforcement actions taken by the agency, after Mulvaney showed up. Perhaps this should not be surprising since Mulvaney hired an individual with well-documented racist views to lead the agency's enforcement of fair lending. Following a March 7th committee hearing with the Consumer Bureau's new director, Kathy Kraninger, I remain concerned. She is following Mulvaney's lead. She has proposed to roll back payday lending protections and reduce the collection of HMDA mortgage data, which helps identify predatory and discriminatory lending practices. She has also left in place a dozen political appointees, unheard of for an independent financial regulator. Mulvaney, hired to control the work of civil servants. According to Seth Frothman, the former student loan ombudsman, Mulvaney's political team suppressed a damning report compiled by professional staff about Wells Fargo and other banks ripping off college students. It is critical that Congress right these wrongs by passing the Consumers First Act. Among other things, H.R. 1500 would restore the supervisory and enforcement powers of the Office of Fair Lending and Equal Opportunity, require adequate staffing of supervision and enforcement, restore the Office of Students and Young Consumers, require the Consumer Complaint Database to remain publicly accessible, limit the number of political appointees who would choose ideology over consumers, and would provide that the Consumer Bureau promptly resume Military Lending Act exams to ensure that service members are not ripped off. Over 50 consumer, civil rights, and labor organizations support the Consumer First Act. The issues addressed in this bill are important for the economic well-being of millions of Americans and our whole economy. The bill makes clear that Congress will not tolerate the Trump administration's anti-consumer actions, and that we will act to ensure the Consumer Bureau fulfills its statutory mission to protect all consumers. Therefore, I urge this committee to advance H.R. 1500 to the House floor and request the committee provide an appropriate rule for its consideration, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you, and I yield back the balance
Thank you
of
very
my
much,
time.
Ms. McHenry.
Well, thank you, Chairman McGovern, and thank you all on the Rules Committee. In my 8 terms in Congress, I've not made it a habit of testifying before this committee. I want to say you're welcome. You have some time that you've gained as a result of that. But I testify today for the first time as lead Republican on the House Financial Services Committee. There have been many bills. This debate. Oh, there you go. Thank you. We're all well accustomed to the contours of this debate on the CFPB, and we have a fundamental disagreement between 2 parties on the direction of the CFPB. At its creation, what I said was with a 5-year term and a single director, given enormous responsibilities, a massive unlimited budget, that you would have, at points of time, a completely unaccountable director doing things that the party that created it would not like. And the Democrats in Congress who created the CFPB thought that time would never come for Democrats. And now, with a Republican administration, we have a Republican appointee who's running the Bureau for a 5-year term with very few checks and balances. And this is an attempt by the Democrat majority here in the House to rewrite those rules, to tell that director what Democrats in the House want that director to do. This is the fundamental flaw of a fundamentally flawed program. And so the CFPB, rather than getting into the fundamentals of it, a bipartisan board, putting it on appropriations, ensuring the structure is right, and therefore the structure could drive better outcomes. Look at the Securities Exchange Commission that has been in place for 90 years and has functioned well in Democrat and Republican administrations in time of economic prosperity and stress, and yet has been resilient through that. This Bureau, by having a single director, will go back and forth between political ideologies and views. This bill is attempting to, what I would say, micromanage the direction of the reports to the CFPB director and the inputs on how they staff. Rather than getting to the fundamental structural issues, it is much more an agenda-oriented bill that we have before us. And so I think there are things that we should be doing in a bipartisan way to reform the CFPB. A bipartisan board, putting on the appropriation cycle, as I mentioned before, having an Office of Inspector General with oversight over this very large agency. Finally, I would submit this. In 21 of the 42 pages of this bill, it is an attack on Mick Mulvaney, who is acting director. Mick Mulvaney is referred to as anti-consumer, destructive, and my personal favorite, as a friend of Mick's, inane, right? My personal favorite because he's in no way inane. He's many, many other things. But the fact that we have 21 pages of findings setting up the problems of the Bureau and then 21 pages of legislative text that do nothing to drive at the fundamentals of that decision-making that is disliked by one party or one ideological view. So this bill is what it is. It is a bill written by Democrats without input by Republicans, brought forward to the House floor to have the debate about the CFPB once again. I'm ready for it. I look forward to your questions. Happy to answer any of those questions you may have. But I'd also commend that given the scope of this bill, it is an ideal bill to bring to the House floor under an open rule. And with that, I yield back.
Ms. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent a district in Southern California, west end of San Bernardino County, a little bit of LA County. It was one of the hardest hit area during the recession when the housing market bubble burst. 1 in 4 of my constituents who were homeowners were foreclosed on. I never want to see that ever again. For me, this is not about one person. It's about ensuring that my poor working class constituents are never taken advantage of again not from predatory lenders who have targeted them because maybe they didn't fully understand, or the contracts were not written in a language that they could truly understand, and were tricked into signing up for a loan that truly they couldn't afford to have. So tell me how this bill, Chairwoman Maxine Waters, how will this bill help constituents like mine? I mean, in California, I was part of the legislature, and we passed several bills to protect homeowners, to ensure that legal documents were translated in popular languages or the language that the buyer spoke. So can you talk a little bit about protecting constituents like the ones that I represent?
Absolutely, and I think your description of what happened in your district certainly describes what was happening all over this country. Let me just say this. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I consider the centerpiece of Dodd-Frank reforms. Why do I consider it the centerpiece? It is because none of our agencies really took the responsibility or had the responsibility or knew they had the responsibility for the protection of consumers. Most of the oversight agencies were designed for so-called security protection to make sure that Wall Street didn't end up doing exactly what it did. But actually, they failed on that, and they did not offer any real protection for consumers. And so I want to tell you, it was Senator Warren who brought this idea together. And it became the first time that consumers really had anybody looking out for them. For those members who were around in 2008, when we basically went into a recession, almost a depression, really understands what was happening with predatory lending and how financial institutions had come up with exotic products, with liar loans, with all kind of new efforts in order to get people to sign on the dotted line for mortgages they really could not afford in most cases. They targeted them to the most vulnerable in our society, to minorities, to women, to communities, where they went in and they not only encouraged people to sign on the dotted line, we discovered a lot of fraud that took place. And then, of course, the devil came due. And these loans that were given sometime, no doc loans that were given out, and loans that were basically marketed that allowed people to start out with a very low interest rate. And of course, those interest rates would increase in 6 months or a year, et cetera. And so many communities were devastated. Houses were boarded up. People did not understand what was going on. Dodd-Frank reforms are extremely important to dealing with predatory lending.
During this time, I was the chair of the community, of the Housing and Community Development Committee in the state legislature, and I travel up and down the state talking to homeowners who were being foreclosed. To the extent that we had the vector control, they had to take action because homes were left abandoned, pools were turning green, they were not being cared for, so we had issues of mosquitoes as well as pets that were left abandoned in backyards. We were able to draw down $2 billion of federal funding, and through that process, we were able to assist 63,000 homeowners stay in their homes who were already being foreclosed. But let me tell you both, that was not easy to do. Trying to deal with financial institutions to negotiate with the state of California to ensure that they were, to keep them from foreclosing on our homeowners. They claimed that they were not, for example, renters, so they did not want to allow the person to stay in the home for the period of time that the foreclosure was moving forward. I mean, that was one of the issues.
And we dealt with a similar issue in North Carolina. It was a miserable process, absolutely.
It is.
That's why I want the Bureau to be long-lasting. That's why a bipartisan board is a far better answer than this bill.
So, but it concerns me when you have this administration that has allowed Eric Blankenstein, a man who questioned, the legitimacy of hate crimes and whether using the N-word is inherently a racist term. When you begin with that mindset, how do I know that, the folks that I represent are not going to once again fall prey to policies that, that they will choose to look the other way like they have in the past? For me, that is the reason why I support this legislation.
Well, let me just tell you this. I served on the conference committee for Dodd-Frank reform, and we worked very hard to ensure that we came up with a way by which we could protect consumers. And the idea of having a single director was to keep them out of the political fray and to ensure that you would not have a commission that was dominated by one side or the other that would undermine the work of the director. And let me just tell you something. The Republicans hated Cordray. They called him before our committee over 60-something times. And I want to tell you, they treated him awful. They badgered him. They literally did everything they could possibly do to try and destroy the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And because Mr. Cordray was very strong, he was an excellent director, and he left to run for governor, and then Mr. Mulvaney came in, and he took an axe to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The Republicans are not on record any place, anywhere, for dealing with consumers. This was 2008. It took us 2 years to get this legislation done. By 2010, we came up with this strong consumer protection, and as I indicated, Mr. Cordray returned millions of dollars to consumers because of the complaints that we got, and we were able to respond to them. And so I would ask this committee to support consumers and support this legislation. This legislation will correct the wrecking ball that Mr. Mulvaney put to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
I support this bill and urge members to support it, and I yield back.
Mr. Cole?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter a statement of administration policy on H.R. 1500, and if I may, let me just read a couple sentences.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1500 would direct the CFPB to pursue short-term partisan agenda rather than one driven by its assessment of the needs of consumers, and further, H.R. 1500 promotes a partisan policy agenda and sets a precedent for dictating the agendas of independent regulators rather than making structural reforms to increase accountability and transparency. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chair, it's good to have you here. You're always a great witness, and but I do have a couple of questions. In the past, I think you've taken the position that, quote, the Fed is like a piggy bank. Surplus funds shouldn't be used like a piggy bank, and it shifts privately generated losses to the public. And another statement, by reducing the Fed surplus account, Congress could negatively affect the Federal Reserve's independence in monetary decisions, making by rendering it dependent on Treasury recapitalization. So, if I understand it right, your bill does use that surplus as a pay-for. Is that correct?
Well, let me just say this so that everyone will understand. There is this argument that Republicans make about the need for this agency to have to go to appropriations for its funding. We purposely, working very hard with Senator Dodd and Congressman Barney Frank, made sure that this agency would have the kind of independence that would allow it to do its work and not be endangered by the politics of any committee, and that includes the Appropriations Committee. And so the Federal Reserve is where it gets its direct funding, and this bill would continue that.
Well, I want to go on and talk about that, but aren't we using the Federal Reserve surpluses to pay for in this bill? And isn't that at odds with your previous position?
No, because the Federal Reserve is the agency that was identified in the original legislation as the place where the funding would come from. This just continues that.
Well, that's fine, but that was not your previous position. Your previous position was you shouldn't use the surplus as a pay-for. Is that correct or not?
No, that is not so.
We'll just agree to disagree because the
Yes.
quotes are there. That's been your position in the past. Mr. McHenry, seems to me like, in a sense, HR 1500 is more like a list of grievances against Mr. Mulvaney than substantive reforms. In fact, aren't most of the changes HR 1500 would make, couldn't that be done through regulatory authority by the CFPB itself?
Absolutely. The director has all the authorities herein. The only thing that is a permanent change in statute would be the official name change. And of all the provisions, other than the 21 pages of this bill, I think that's the only piece of it.
So having set this up to run independently and not have congressional interference, my friends are now upset because we can't interfere very, very easily?
The fundamental issue is who has a direct report to the director. And whether or not that is a direct report of one agency or two agencies or three agencies, right? And so what they want to do is segment this out in a different way than the director does, even though the report structure would be similar to what new Director Kraninger has set up.
Okay, well, again, I'm an appropriator in full disclosure, so the chair might disagree with me on this, but this is one where I think we made a bad mistake, my personal view, in not keeping this agency within the appropriations process. The very concerns that you're expressing here are partly because it's extremely difficult for Congress to have much oversight. That was the decision that the current majority made when they were the majority last time.
Right.
And so, I mean, to complain about
So-
it now seems to me, you know.
Well, the other fundamental issue we could have for reform, it would be bipartisan, is an inspector general for the CFPB. The Fed Inspector General oversees the CFPB as well as the fullness of the Fed. The Fed has the largest balance sheet of any bank, any financial institution on the globe. So that IG is taken up with larger issues rather than this one agency. Ms. Torres mentioned racist comments by a staff person at the Bureau. Had then Acting Director Mulvaney had an IG that was focused on the Bureau, he could have referred those comments and action be taken against that person. And that did not happen in a timely fashion, though that person departed from the Bureau, as I've learned, about a week ago. The fact that we don't have an independent inspector general for that Bureau is a limitation that should be a good governance piece that we should all agree to.
Obviously, you two have very different opinions on the legislation, but I assume there's some bipartisan reforms that you both agree on. Are there any of them in this bill?
No.
Missed opportunity. Let me ask you this. If you wanted to make the agency more accountable to the American people, give me 3 or 4 things that you think would make it.
The number one thing would be to look at the Securities Exchange Commission, their structure. You have a bipartisan panel. It doesn't perfectly do what I want or any member of Congress does, but it has withstood the test of time. It has given enormous import for the regulation of Wall Street, the issuance of securities, not just for us, but still the global leader for capital formation runs through the Securities and Exchange Commission. We set the standards for the world. And it's because that institution is enduring. Now, we have complaints about individual directors. I didn't like the approach of Elizabeth Warren. I didn't like Director Cordray's approach. I better liked Mick Mulvaney's approach. He was just an acting director there to preserve the agency and make the decisions he was forced to make. And what Director Kraninger's going to do, well, we'll all find out together, because she doesn't have to come to Capitol Hill for appropriations. She doesn't have to come back to Capitol Hill for any of her decision makings. And so she can actually take whatever route she wants. And if my Democrat colleagues don't like it, or if my Republican colleagues don't like it, well, you can write a letter. You can write a letter, and you may hear back. And that is how the agency is structured. I think it's deeply flawed, not just for these times, but for all times in the nature of the power it's been given, without any check or balance.
And look, as I recall, in previous Congresses, we tried to do that, those things. We tried to make it subject to appropriation. My friends all opposed that. So,
Yes.
we're living with the institution now that you created. We didn't create it, didn't get any Republican votes. It's hard for Congress to manage it. We tried to offer a number of suggestions to do that. They were uniformly rejected.
My colleague just made
Sorry,
made a political argument about not liking the Democrats, not liking.
Oh, I like
Ms. Warren.
Democrats. No, I was just saying we disagree.
You don't have to tell us who you like or you don't like. You made that argument talking about why you didn't support any of the Democrats, Mr. Cordray or Ms. Warren. Let me just tell you that we insisted on an independent director. The consumers of this country deserve to have someone in all of this government looking out for them. They had no one prior to the adoption of Dodd-Frank reforms. And so we know that Ms. Kraninger can do whatever she wants to do, and she's carrying out the same agenda Mr. Mulvaney did. And so we prefer to understand and know that this may happen at this point, where the appointment is being made by the President of the United States, who happened to be a Republican. However, we don't think that'll last forever.
Well, that may be true, but it seems to me the problem you're pointing out here is that you created something in the assumption you could control it indefinitely, and the Congress shouldn't have any oversight. Well, now that director is independent, and they do have that authority, and Congress doesn't have any oversight.
But when you talk about a commission, nobody describes what it is.
That we ought to try to avoid that thing. I think we're here because, again, the idea was to deal Congress out rather than deal Congress in. I think it was a big mistake, and I think you're reaping the harvest that your side sowed on this. So let me just end with that, Mr. Chairman. But the one remark I will make in closing, look, this isn't going to become law. So you guys will spend a lot of time because it's not going through the Senate. The president's not going to sign it. And, if we do a lot of that up here these days, and I guess we'll do it again here, but I would really urge you both, because you're both excellent legislators. And frankly, you both work together well. I know you differ strongly on this, but I've seen you work together well. But there are some bipartisan things here that I think we could agree on. And I hope once this round is launched, and it's not going to get very far, get across the House floor, and that'll be about it. Maybe we can come back with a bill that really is bipartisan, that the Senate will embrace, and hopefully the President will sign. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Perlmutter. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in response to Mr. Cole and to some of the things Mr. McHenry has said, I mean, there's never been bipartisan agreement on the CFPB. I was part of the people that voted on this. I think you were opposed to it. You said your points that, no, we don't want a single director. No, we don't want the Fed to be paying for it. We want congressional appropriation. And the purpose of this was to give it independence and not to have it go up and down with whoever was the majority in the Congress at the time. Now, am I happy about what's going on now with this particular director and and with Mr. Mulvaney, who's a friend of mine too? That doesn't mean I don't have grievances against the way he operated the Bureau. And I think the purpose of this bill is to bring back what we thought was the real intent behind the CFPB. And there was a discussion about mortgages and the practices in the mortgage industry, unsuitable, lending that was going on, the sharp practices where we saw double billing cycles, we saw, overdraft fees that were, $35 on a buck overdraft, penalties and things like that would keep people, under the gun all the time. And that was the kind of sharp practice we saw
in advance of the recession. And we also saw the Fed had a lot of responsibility for that. We saw that the FTC had responsibility for some of these things, but it wasn't happening. So that was the real reason behind the CFPB. Somebody focused only on consumers and consumers first. That's the name of this bill, and that's the point here. So I support this bill 100%. I don't really like the personality, that we do pick on Mr. Mulvaney a lot, but in effect, he has really undercut a lot of the protections that we hoped would be there. To Mr. Cole's point, you're right. We've given a lot of authority to one individual in hopes that that individual would look out after consumers. And we want to provide that information again in this particular bill. We have had a lot of bipartisan bills come out of our committee, and we will begin to see those in this Rules Committee very soon.
You authored one of them. You authored one of them.
Well, and I've authored one of them, right. But this one's been a fight from the very beginning. It was a fight when it was part of Dodd-Frank. It's going to be a fight now, and it may go nowhere in the Senate. Nothing's going anywhere in the Senate except judges. That's it. So I'm not, the fact that this runs into a buzzsaw or runs into a place that, just a black hole, that's not, in my opinion, a good argument, because nothing's getting through over there.
Well,
so I turn it, I don't mean to do a monologue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter. This argument about they would have you believe that it is unusual to have an agency that does not get its funding through the Appropriations Committee. Let me just remind everybody, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the OCC, the NCUA, the FHFA, FSOC, that is FSOC, and OFR, none of them go before Appropriations Committee.
Thank you for reminding me. We use those agencies as a model for having regulatory independence.
Absolutely.
But nobody was looking out for the consumer first.
That's right.
They were looking out for everything else.
That's right.
So I appreciate some of the criticisms. Would a commission be better? Would something else be a little better? Maybe. But this was the one that fit the bill the best, and I think still does. And I appreciate the chairwoman bringing this bill and trying to restore a number of the concerns that created the CFPB in the first place.
Well, Mr. Perlmutter, before you go to him, I just want to, respond to this idea of bipartisanship. What's interesting about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is this. It had an advisory committee that certainly was more bipartisan. The first thing Mr. Mulvaney did was to destroy the advisory committee, sent them home. We no longer have an advisory committee. And that at least had some semblance of bipartisanship. I yield back.
So the last point, and it's a small one, but I would say to my friend, Mr. McHenry, that it's the Democratic majority, it's the Democratic colleagues, it's the Democratic Party, not the Democrat majority, not the Democrat Party. And no offense, but that was like their fingernails on a blackboard. So
I'll just say a couple icks for you to make up for it.
You don't want me to call you a publican, do you?
I've heard worse.
Okay.
Thanks.
I
didn't mean that as any slight whatsoever.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is not lost on me that this was a contentious issue from the beginning, and it pains me to sit here as Article I legislators complaining about how the position that we created on the other end of the Pennsylvania Avenue isn't being used the way we wanted it to, when we created it to be used completely independently by whoever happened to be in the White House at that time. Lots of things that we could have done differently when we created this agency. I would ask the chairwoman, I understand that there's not a lot of bipartisanship on CFPB, but the bipartisanship I see is moving away from folks who voted yes to that strong independence to begin with, moving towards voting yes to a congressional appropriation so that we wouldn't have a White House that runs roughshod over the Article 1 Congress. But I seem to understand you to say that you continue to have the vision that it should be independently funded and should remain unaccountable to Congress going forward?
I continue to be a strong advocate for the independence of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I still maintain that consumers had no protection in this federal government. And I have cited for you the success of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau under Mr. Cordray. And I've also indicated how those successes are being destroyed by Mr. Mulvaney and following up by Mrs. Cranninger. And that's my position. I feel strongly about it. I feel it is a correct position, and I want you to know that whether we're talking about the destruction of the Consumer Advisory Committee, or the undermining of service members, or the supporting of payday loans, we believe we're on the right side of history of protecting consumers. Yes, sir.
What has the new director said to you when you've talked to her about restoring the advisory committee?
When she came before the committee, she defended Mr. Mulvaney's work for the most part. And she continues to do that and even go further with HMDA data and with other issues like debt collection, et cetera, while she's there. She supports Mr. Mulvaney's position.
Though to be fair, you identified the advisory committee as being unusually partnership oriented. So many of those other things that you talk about are divisive, and we all know them to be divisive in how they are enforced and how they are administered. Just thinking about the advisory committee in general as a starting point, looking for that way forward, what opinions has she expressed about that in conversations with the chairwoman?
She has not indicated that she's prepared to put back the advisory committee as we had envisioned it.
Well, I did not like the creation of an entity that was not accountable to Congress to begin with, and I feel your frustrations.
I'm not frustrated, and I'm not unhappy. I am simply an advocate for the consumers of this country. I know that Mr. Cole indicated I was upset. I'm not upset. I know exactly what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and I believe that we're on the right track to protect the consumers of this country.
Well, that's certainly a shared value. So
Yes, well, I'm so pleased about that.
So, Mr. Woodall, on the advisory committee, Director Cranninger has publicly stated that she is going to reinstate this advisory committee.
Well, I guess that was kind of my point, is that we seem to be so wrapped around the axle, plenty of things to get wrapped around the axle about, but that wouldn't be one of them. That seems to be one of those things that we're together on, and so I'm glad that folks are not frustrated and they're not upset, because my experience is we solve very few problems when we're frustrated and upset. We solve more problems when, like my friend from Colorado, we disagree vehemently with people's policies, even though we love them dearly as our friends and respect them along the way. Mr. Chairman, you're one of those folks for me, and I'm grateful to you for it. I yield back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raskin. He left? Ms. Scanlon. He came and he went.
Could you talk to this so I can hear you? Yes.
I always leave it on.
Okay, all right.
I'd like to thank you for your leadership in introducing this legislation. It's got some really important pieces for folks in my district.
Yes.
That have been missing as the rollback has occurred with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Yes.
Active duty borrowers depend on supervision from the CFPB to make sure that loans they're being offered aren't predatory and that they comply with the Military Lending Act. And I understand Director Mulvaney has eliminated the supervisory exams for those loans.
That's right.
Students trying to earn degrees need the CFPB to watch out for lenders who try to take advantage of them. And again, they've proposed shrinking those agency resources to reduce oversight. And low-income families who are routinely victimized by exorbitant interest rates and loan sharks need to look to the CFPB. So I appreciate all of your work to try to restore those protections and look forward to supporting the bill. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Congresswoman Scanlon, Representative Barr on our committee has offered a military lending act amendment related to that to give the CFPB supervisory authority under that area of law. That's one I would urge the Rules Committee to support. I think it's a fantastic addition to the debate on the floor as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. I will have an amendment dealing with the appropriation or making the financing of the CFPB a part of our normal appropriations process, as we've done in other Congresses. It is important to bring it back under appropriate congressional oversight. I appreciate the differences of opinion that have been expressed here today. And like you, Mr. McHenry, I don't actually expect much to change, but nevertheless, we need to have the discussion. So thank you both for being here, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, both of you, for being here. My question is for Mr. McHenry. You know, I was reading this bill, and there's a whole bunch of pages that are just kind of attacking Mr. Mulvaney, and it goes on in one page, I think it's page number 9, it says, it quotes an anonymous advisor in a Politico article. Is it normal to put this type of stuff in legislation that you're hoping to turn into law?
I haven't seen it.
Thank you. My next question, yeah, I found it very unusual. My next question is actually, you know, since you're the ranking member in the Financial Services Committee, I appreciate what you do. And I know there were several amendments that were offered by my Republican colleagues, and one of them was actually an amendment from Representative Stile, who's over here right now. And it said it would cut out the 20-page, basically, rant that's in this bill and instead require the Comptroller General to study the effectiveness and efficiency of the CFPB. Do you think that was a good amendment, and do you think that's better than, you know, this
Sure.
dialogue?
I think it's a better approach than what we have in legislative text before us. And given that a new member from Wisconsin has thought through this idea and offered a great amendment, I think I would commend this to the Rules Committee to support and our colleagues on the floor to support.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Unlike the previous bill, which I thought had good bipartisan work, this one seems very partisan to me, and obviously I won't be supporting it. Thank you.
Ms. Shalala?
Like my colleague, I'm particularly concerned about the military lending issue and the student loan issue. When the military lending issue was, basically the office was eliminated, there was no consultation with the Defense Department, and every military organization that represents the military, every non-governmental organization said that it should be restored. And they said specifically that this organization was important to active duty military and that their role was important. I understand that separate legislation has been introduced, but I'm also concerned in my district about the students and holding the the loan organizations that give student loans accountable, because the Department of Education is not doing that now. And therefore, this language is important. I look forward to supporting the bill.
Mr. Dishall, yeah? No? Okay.
And again, I would commend the Barr amendment to this committee. It deals precisely the Military Lending Act that Ms. Shalala and Ms. Scanlon mentioned.
Will you call on Mr. McHenry?
I'm sorry, I was addressing the questions raised.
Well, you, at the very same time, during the course of the proceedings, you have a tendency just to break in, and I just wanted to remind you of our protocol in that regard. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Please leave anything you would like inserted into the record without stenography, and you are now relieved.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, before I get to my amendment, I do want to thank my good friend, Mr. Perlmutter, who was here earlier, and he mentioned the Graves Amendment. The Graves-Davis Amendment would actually add a GPO fix to this bill, and I certainly hope that my friends in the majority will make that amendment in order, because it will actually accomplish the goal that Mr. Perlmutter mentioned just a few short minutes ago. The amendment I'm talking about today is Amendment Number 7, and it strikes from the findings a section that my colleague Ms. Lesko just mentioned. It's a Politico article that mentions our former colleague, Mr. Mulvaney. And you know, I consider myself a part of the governing wing of our Republican Party. And many of you on the other side of the dais are personal friends. We've worked together on many issues, and I really want to work in a bipartisan manner to get things done. But I am very upset that a good portion of this bill that we're talking about today is focused on our former colleague in a personal sense. And I certainly hope, no matter where we all go in the future, if somebody in this room is part of a future administration, I certainly hope that whomever is in the majority does not personally mention anyone individually. Because there really, as in Mr. Mulvaney's case, he's just doing his job. He is taking his philosophical viewpoint and his ideas of what is going to make the CFPB work better and helping to implement them. While Mr. Mulvaney and I did not agree on everything when we were serving together, I certainly am offended by the fact that Mr. Mulvaney is mentioned in this bill and through anonymous sources in an article. These are the types of things that don't lead to bipartisan solutions. They don't lead to more civility here in this institution, and they certainly don't lead to us being able to vote for those provisions, regardless of how many times Mick and I disagreed when we served together, and regardless of how many times Mick and I disagree when we serve together now. So I certainly hope that this bill, that this amendment can get added or get stripped. Certainly hope it is accepted by the majority. I certainly hope all the Democrats accept it. And Mr. Perlmutter, thank you for coming back. I hope you heard that there's a chance to get the Social Security GPO fix in this, and I certainly hope you vote to make that amendment in order. But please, let's not make this personal. Let's take this out. It's an easy amendment. Help us help you to move this bill forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. In a similar light, my amendment strikes the findings in the bill that complain about the governance of the CFPB, as noted by my colleague from Colorado as well as my colleague from Arizona, and replaces them instead with a requirement that the Comptroller General conduct a study on the Bureau. The CFPB has an important mission of protecting consumers from abuse and empower people who make good financial choices, regardless of who's in charge in Washington. And with that in mind, Chairman Waters is right to call attention to the CFPB's governance. And that's why I'm introducing the amendment for the Consumer First Act. The study would analyze the effectiveness and efficiency of the CFPB in meeting its obligation, the prevalence of discriminatory lending practices, and the protection of workplace rights for CFPB staff. I think anyone who's read about the past abuses at the unaccountable agency should be concerned with its structure that empowers regulatory overreach and has been allowed to persist. I know my colleagues have a range of ideas of how best to move the CFPB forward, and this amendment does not address that larger question. Today's amendment merely recognizes that Congress has a responsibility to ensure that the Bureau is fulfilling its mission and that an independent audit, not findings, is the best way to move towards that goal. To my hope that there's no objection to getting an unbiased look at what the Bureau does right, what it does wrong, so we can find common ground on the best way to protect consumers. I urge this committee to this amendment in order, so the full House will have a chance to consider it. Thank you.
Start of the second vote, and members are asked to return immediately after they vote. And I think Mr. Burgess and Ms. Jackson Lee are going to have amendments when we come.
study should take place that deals with the results in erroneous information being added to credit files of consumers. My constituents are most impacted by this, particularly minority consumers who have paid their bills. Some pay with cash and money orders, and wrong information has gotten into the reporting, and many poor and minority communities don't know how to check or have fixed their report, and it's being given to financial institutions, and therefore this would ease the burden if we understood or had a report dealing with how much of that is going on, and also to determine which consumers can apply mechanisms to lock and unlock access to consumer report data for credit granting purposes, which I think is extremely important. Amendment number 34 adds to the findings that online and in-store consumer activities and transactions, including brand and customer loyalty programs, allow for greater collection of detailed information on individual consumers. The bill directs that a study be done on the extent to which financial institutions rely upon analysis of individual consumer activities, interests in buying and spending patterns to make decisions regarding extensions of credit, targeted marketing, etc. The study shall also address the extent to which such data collection and analysis may constitute unlawful or discriminatory profiling, which does occur in the arena of credit. And so I'd ask my colleagues to support this, and I ask to put into the record an article by Gillian B. Wright, When Algorithms Don't Count for Civil Rights. Ask unanimous consent to put that in the record. I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Hastings? I have no question. Mr. Cole? Mr. Perlmutter? No? Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here, and thank you for your amendments and for your words of wisdom. We appreciate it. Thank you. Is Burgess coming? A couple of amendments. So, okay, no one else is wishing to testify? So this closes the hearing portion of HR 1500. At this point, yeah, we can go. From who? At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a structured rule for consideration of HR 1500, the Consumers First Act. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-15 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part A of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 1994, the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act, Secure Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill.
The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means, now printed in the bill, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from May 24th, 2019 through May 31st, 2019, the journal of proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. The rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 3. The rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 3 shall not constitute a legislative day for the purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 15, the consensus calendar. The rule provides that it shall be in order at any time on the legislative day of May 23, 2019, for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules relating to a measure making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019. The rule waives the requirement of Clause 6A of Rule 13 for a two-thirds vote to consider a report from the Committee on Rules on the same day it is presented to the House with respect to any resolution reported through the legislative day of May 23, 2019, relating to a measure making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019. Finally, the rule provides that the Committee on Appropriations may at any time before 5 p.m. on Sunday, June 2nd, 2019, file privilege reports to accompany measures making appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2020.
You heard the motion of the gentleman from Colorado, and before I ask if there's any amendments or discussion, let me apologize to Mr. Burgess for proceeding without waiting for you to testify. But it may have helped, because I think both your amendments are in order. So, in any event, anyway, at this point, are there any amendments or discussion at this time? Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move to amend the rule to provide that on adoption of the rule, H.R. 1500 is recommitted to the Committee on Financial Services with instructions to strike Section 2, which is findings sent to the Congress. Mr. Chairman, over 19 pages, or almost 50% of a 40-page bill, are partisan findings that read more like what the British would call a bill of attainder targeted at Mr. Mulvaney. I'll read the definition if any of you wonder what a bill of attainder is. Not that at times he hasn't deserved a bill of attainder, but he doesn't in this case.
Okay.
But Mr. Mulvaney, let me just go. I guess we shouldn't be surprised as this remains in line with the Democratic majority's consistent theme of political messaging over good governance. Mr. Chairman, I think the American people are going to get tired of it sooner or later, and my unsolicited advice remains that the Democratic majority needs to get serious about passing real legislation that leads to good governance. Let's strip the partisan findings from this legislation and focus on some real bipartisan reforms the American people entrusted us to do.
I thank the gentleman. You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any comments or discussion? Or hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Any further amendments? Woodall? I threw right to you, but I know he had something.
I think it's going to be helpful. My amendment would postpone consideration of H.R. 1500 until such time as Mr. Barr's bill, H.R. 969, the TABS Act, which does provide then for congressional appropriations for the CFPB, to consider the TABS Act prior to considering HR 1500. There is nothing bipartisan about HR 1500, Mr. Chairman, but there is something bipartisan, and we'll get to hear from Democratic appropriators later about bringing this agency under Article 1 control so that we never have to worry about what the White House is doing, whether it be Republican or Democratic White House.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Woodall amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. No. Opinion Chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, can I get a recorded vote?
A recorded vote has been requested.
Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further, Mr. Cole, again? Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've got an amendment to the rule. I move to strike the language self-executing amendment to number 1 in H.R. 1994 by Mr. Neal. Mr. Chairman, as we discussed today, H.R. 1994 was negotiated with bipartisan approval, yet because of pressures from outside interest groups, Speaker Pelosi's decided to back out on that deal. While there's still a lot to like in this bill, I really want to stress it, and I want to compliment Mr. Neal for the bipartisanship he displayed. Let's not for a second week in a row allow interest groups to dictate legislation on the floor of the House. It's not what the American people sent us to Washington to do. Let's strike the self-executed manager's amendment and move forward with the original deal negotiated by Mr. Neal and Mr. Brady. Democrats really want to make these changes. The entire House should have the opportunity to vote on them.
Thank you. You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Mr. Burgess.
Yeah, just a further discussion. And I don't think the rank and file members of the House of Representatives are aware of the special interest pressure that has been brought to bear on this. I don't understand it. I don't know that I've ever seen anything quite like it. This seems, as Mr. Cole has illustrated, a very bipartisan concept, and yet it is being derailed by an outside special interest group, and it's just wrong. That should not be the way we legislate. So I hope you will make Mr. Cole's amendment in order. I believe it is important to do that.
Which special interest groups are you referring to that put the undue pressure on Mr. Neal? I'm just curious.
He would not tell me, so I have some suspicions, but I asked both of our witnesses to tell me, to help me understand.
I think Mr. Neal said that there was concern within our caucus, and they raised issues. But I'm just curious. I mean, if there's a group that you want to name that is responsible for this, that runs contrary to what Mr. Neal testified.
I have not heard from them, but
I haven't either. I haven't either.
As a member of the House of Representatives, I don't understand why what otherwise is a bipartisan process coming through one of the oldest committees in the United States House of Representatives would be derailed, and why the Speaker wouldn't bring it to the floor unless this provision was struck. And we've heard from other members how important this is to a child of one of our own members. So
Well, I'm sure the gentleman knows he has a motion to recommit, and this will probably be your motion to recommit.
Well,
or you may pick something else. It's up to you. Can pick whatever you want.
You provide us with multiple opportunities.
So we'll have this. We'll have this debate.
Recommit.
We'll have this debate. Thank you. Let's go.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be supporting Mr. Cole's amendment. However, I want to put on record that I do like the part that helps the military families.
Thank you, and I know you do.
And thank you.
We appreciate that. So now the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The chair, the noes have it. Roll call.
Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Burgess? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment to the rule to make in order and provide the necessary waivers for amendment number 6 to H.R. 1994, offered by Mr. Graves of Louisiana. This amendment repeals the government pension offset and the windfall elimination provisions. These two titles of the Social Security Act unfairly reduce or eliminate Social Security benefits for millions of Americans who have devoted much of their careers to public service. The windfall elimination provision reduces the earned benefits of an individual who also receives a public pension from a job not covered by Social Security, while the government pension offset affects the spousal benefits of people who work at federal, state, or local government employees if the job is not covered by Social Security. These outdated provisions deprive public employees of the benefits that they have earned and the secure retirement that they deserve, and this amendment should be made in order.
Well, I certainly support what the amendment is trying to do, because a lot of my constituents are impacted by that. But I've spoken to Mr. Neal, and he has promised that the Ways and Means Committee is going to take this matter up, and so I'm going to take him at his word and respect his wishes, and I will vote no on this. Any other discussion or comments? Hearing none, the vote is on the Burgess Amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call is requested.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
And the clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 6
Amendment
nays.
is not agreed to. Further amendments. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 4 to H.R. 1994, offered by Mr. Mitchell from Michigan. This amendment amends the manager's amendment to restore the provisions relating to 529 education savings accounts by maintaining subsections B and D of Section 302 as reported from the Committee on Ways and Means. We've discussed this before, but I believe that keeping these in helps all children, no matter if they attend public schools or are homeschooled. And I ask for all of my colleagues' support.
You heard the General Lady's amendment. Any comments or discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Lesko amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call. Vote.
Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
The clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 6 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Being none, the question is now on the motion offered from the gentleman from Colorado. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Roll call has been requested.
Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala? Mr. DeSaulnier? Aye. Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
6 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to. And this will be carried by Mr. Perlmutter for the majority.
And by Mr. Woodall for the Republican.
And so I think that we may meet again if there's an emergency supplemental that is ready. So that's, yeah, and so that's the only other thing I have to report. So with that, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.